Hello, art appreciators, art historians, artists. Hope you're good today. Welcome to this lecture today on Chapter 7 of Living with Art by Mark Getlein. It is, yeah, that's all we're going to cover. We're going to cover painting. That's what Chapter 7 is over. And if you remember from yesterday, I got through. I have actually the slides. This slideshow combines chapter 6 and 7, and we covered 6 yesterday, and that was drawing, and that led us right up to painting. So we covered the kind of the reasons people sketch and make stuff yesterday, and then we covered all the dry materials of graphite, charcoal, pastel, Conte, and then as well as like wet material of ink and like other like liquid suspended drawing materials, where again it's just the pigment and then the liquid water or whatever is suspending it. So that got us through the drawing materials. Again, that's chapter 6. So no, chapter 7, just a quickie, we're going to jump right into talking about what materials make painting different from drawing. Obviously, taking a thing and making a mark, it's not that dissimilar. But with painting, there are some things that make it different. Number one, the biggest thing is that pretty much all painting, depending on how loose you are with the definition, for the purpose of our definition, it's always liquid, right? It's always fluid and you spread it, okay? Rather than like make just a dry mark, right? It's fluid, you spread it and it's got to dry, okay? And there's some other differences, which we'll get to later. Remember, yesterday I asked you to think about what really is the difference between drawing and painting. And obviously, the materials are going to be a big difference, right? So, the materials that make paint different is that in the case of painting, the pigment is mixed with a vehicle or medium, which I know is really confusing because medium already means the thing you make art with, but it has another meaning of being a fluid, right, that holds pigments together. So that's a separate definition of the term medium, because there are all kinds of paint mediums. You can add mediums that have sandy textures that dry faster, dry slower, whatever. But in whatever the case is, this medium or vehicle is something, it's a liquid that holds particles together while they are spread. So it's not just a binder, not just the thing that holds pigments together, but it's a thing that allows you to then spread those pigments and they stay together. And it's always pretty much a liquid. And we call it a vehicle or a medium. Yeah, so that's, and the pigment, which we already learned about what pigment is, it's the color material. It's either a mineral or some sort of like dye or something that makes the color of a art making material, and it's part of drawing already. But in the case of painting, there's also the vehicle. Now, pigments in paint do usually still have a binder, keeping the pigments on the paper, just like with the drawing material. When you scratch, it needs to stick to the paper, and the binder helps it do that. The binder is also in a painting material. Okay, so basically, pigment and binder is true for both drawing and painting, but in the case of paint, the binder is always a liquid, and there's also another liquid of a vehicle or medium. Okay, I hope that helps. Drawing is just pigment and binder. Painting is vehicle, pigment, and binder. Okay, then some other materials that you should know about when talking about paint is that because it's liquid, it obviously won't hold itself up, so you need to put it on a support. There has to be something that supports it, and this support or surface upon which you are painting, it's basically what it is. The support is the thing you're painting on. It's a canvas, a paper, or a panel, or a wall, or a computer, or a phone, or whatever you're painting on. That thing you're painting on is often called a support. Okay, and it's because as you spread it, it's going to help support and hold those pigments that are in the vehicle, right? And the binder is going to help it hold onto the support, blah, blah, blah. Now, there are some other terms to know as well. There's often in a painting, unlike a drawing, you will use a primer. A primer is something you apply to your support before you paint, and it usually is to help a paint spread or adhere. So like when you're painting on a canvas, I'm sure many of you have heard, if you've ever done or looked into painting, you've heard of gesso. And gesso is a primer that basically, because canvas is a fabric, it's really absorbent. So if you go in with your nice fancy paint and go to spread it, it's going to start to absorb, like the canvas will absorb your paint really quickly, and it's not going to spread as far, and it's going to dry really fast, and you're going to have to use more to get full color. So when we use canvas, we typically put the gesso primer onto the canvas, and it will basically it flattens the surface. It makes it's almost like a paint in and of itself. It's like a plastic white paint that you spread, and it basically makes the canvas less absorbent. It makes it smoother so the painting will spread, and it sort of, since it's taking away that absorption, you won't have to use as much paint to get full color once you start actually painting. So yeah, the primer, it's the same thing you see on cars too. Like when we paint on metal, we know that paint doesn't always adhere super great to metal, depending on the type of paint. So you add a paint called a primer that's like texturized, and it holds to metal really well. And then you paint your mechanic, your auto paint on top of that. And the paint is really holding to the primer, and then the primer is holding to the thing. Okay. Now, two different types of painting. This is not quite a material, but something you should know about painting, and it's going to help us break it down. Is there's aqueous painting and there's non-aqueous painting. Aqueous painting means it can be diluted with water, so it basically it uses a water-based medium. Basically the vehicle is water-based in some way. So if you add water to it, it'll get thinner. You can clean it up with water, right, and all that sort of stuff. Now, non-aqueous paints are paints that are where an oil is the vehicle. Okay, some sort of oil is the vehicle. So you can't just clean it up with water because, oil and water resist. So you have to get some sort of diluent like turpentine, or use any kind of oil-based medium. So you can get, people use coconut oil, people use lavender oil, mint oil, or linseed oil, of course, is probably the most common. And it helps you, again, you can kind of thin down the paint to do like glazes or layers, or it helps it spread faster, or, a non-aqueous medium. It's like an oil that'll slow the dry time, speed the dry time up. Yeah, all that kind of stuff. Make it shinier, make it softer. So there you go. Those are more materials to break down, what makes a paint a little bit different than a drawing. And the biggest thing is the addition of a vehicle, and then possibly primers and a support. And then, yeah, that sometimes it can be oil-based, okay? Which I guess oil pastels are oil-based, but in any case, they're still dry. They don't have the vehicle to help them spread. But in any case, let's talk about the different kinds of painting. So the first, and we're starting with aqueous painting, so they're water-based. The first one is fresco. In a fresco, the typical, like true fresco, is called wet. So wet fresco, which is also sometimes called blonde, which means true, or there's dry fresco. And basically what it is plaster as the support. So you spread, plaster, which is a mixture of limestone and some other chemically reactive ingredients with water. And as you spread it, it slowly dries and becomes really, really hard, almost like stone. Okay, that's what plaster is. Most of us have used plaster of Paris to some extent. But yeah, you put plaster on a surface, and then you paint onto the plaster. So typically fresco is used for more like murals, or like something you put on like a whole wall, because you cover the wall in plaster and then you paint that. Now, the plaster is basically used as a support, and the pigment is just mixed with water. So water is the vehicle, and kind of you could say the plaster is the support as well as the binder. So you actually will paint onto the plaster, and because plaster is porous, it will absorb the water that is full of pigment, and that paint will stick to the plaster and dry. So yeah, you spread the pigment over the plaster, it is absorbed, and there's your paint. The downside of painting with fresco is because it is just absorbing right into the plaster. You essentially can't repaint it. You can't adjust. There's no painting over or erasing or anything like that. You basically, if you mess up, you have to wait for the plaster to dry, chip it all off, and then start over. So it's again typically an older method, although we do use it in modern times as well if we've got to cover a large area. But I will say what's different is that if you saw or kind of caught in the first definition, the wet versus dry, old timey like, old day frescoes were typically done wet. So what that meant is essentially this is why they had employees and assistants as well, as there were always people there to keep the pigments mixed up and mixed with water. And then as the artist put the plaster on and started painting, they would immediately well, actually, they would immediately stick an underdrawing, that cartoon thing we learned about yesterday, where there's like charcoal drawn on a paper. They would stick that paper on, the charcoal would kind of stick to the wet plaster, they peel it off, and then they would be handed the pigment and water, and they would have to paint it all in while the plaster was still wet. This made sure that those pigments were chemically bonded to the plaster, okay? But what they figured out over time is you could use certain kinds of pigments in other vehicles to you could paint over dry plaster. You didn't have to catch it all while it was wet. That's why, the true wet plaster is why, when you hear about the Sistine Chapel, they would talk about they have to do all the whole painting in like a day. Well, that's because they had to do it all while the plaster was still drying. Plaster does take a long time to totally finish setting up. And so they had like a day, but if they messed up, they would just have to chip it all down and start over. Versus with dry plaster, you can kind of like spread it and then paint slowly and I guess probably patch it and different things. So dry or secco plaster is kind of a common way to do it now because it's a little more forgiving. Yeah, but the old true fresco it all had to be painted while the plaster was still drying, like within the first 24 hours. So pretty wild. Yeah, so jump around there. Hopefully that kind of helps you understand fresco. Like I said, even now we do use it for fresco. Diego Rivera most famously painted frescoes all over Mexico, and I think he used the true wet fresco method. And he kind of put in political ideas and some of his beliefs and messages into these big mural paintings all over Mexico. And yeah, he used this plaster method. So it's just painting pigments onto that drying plaster. Same was done for the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo all the way up to now, but it was used in antiquity as well. Okay. So another aqueous form of paint is actually another very, very old form of painting used as far back as I think like Egypt and Greece and stuff like that. And it's an aqueous paint, but it's tougher and longer lasting than let's say acrylic or even like plaster. It's a pigment that is in a stable aqueous mix with an emulsion. So the emulsion is sort of the vehicle and binder. And what an emulsion is an oil, a fat, a wax, or a resin. And I know it's confusing because you're like, well, wait, oil, it can't be aqueous if it's oil. Well, it's a natural oil. So a natural oil or fat like egg yolk, or milk, they're both very common. They're like those fatty, natural, like kind of emulsions just helped the paint mix and stick to whatever it was being painted on. So the emulsion again it's the vehicle, it's the binder, holds everything together. And yeah, basically it's just mixing paint with, like I said, like egg whites and water or milk and water. And it's usually painted onto a wooden support. Milk paint, if you look this up, milk paint is like an old way of finishing furniture as well. They would use skim milk even without any pigments or anything to just sort of seal wooden work. So yeah, they figured out it adheres, and so like the tempera paint will stick to wood. It usually dries very quickly, so it has to be built up like a drawing, right? You can do a layer, then let it dry, and then do another layer, and back and forth. It's still not very forgiving though, because it is a thin mixture with like the liquid fat. It's pretty tough to get to paint over. So you got to be pretty accurate. There's not a lot of forgiveness there, but a little more than plaster, of course. You don't have to chip it down and start over. But in any case, this also led to, just to add a little fun fact, there's an effect when you look, and it happens on oil paintings, but it even more so happened on old like egg tempera paintings. Like back in the day, during all the way up to the Renaissance, they had artists, mixing up their pigments with egg when they were painting on canvas. Oil paint hadn't been invented yet. But they would mix and make tempera paintings all the way up to the Renaissance that now we look back at, and they have this really cool effect. Over time, those emulsions shift and change and possibly degrade and move, and it causes the paint to get this really faint little crackle all the way across it, usually real evenly. And it's actually something we almost seek after now. It's kind of a cool effect that you see after centuries of a tempera painting. You see a little bit, like I said, with oil paint, but even more so with a tempera painting. You see this crackleure, if you've ever seen that, like little crackle effect. It's pretty cool. So yeah, this is again, I'm kind of reiterating. Tempera was used. It was kind of the favored method all the way up to the Renaissance, and of course, yeah, we still see lots of people do it now. This is Andrew Wyeth, Christina's World. I usually have you guys do like a quick conversational, like DAIJ discussion of this piece, but since it's a video, I'm just gonna. If you want to pause and like do a little practice, like describe, analyze, interpret, judge, you can do that. I really enjoy this piece. A lot of people find it unsettling. I kind of typically find that my students in the more rural campuses enjoy it more than the students in city campuses. It's fun thing. But yeah, if you want to pause it, work through, the lines, the implied line of where she's looking, the lines of her face, the line of her body, the different values of the grass, the perspective, all that. Work through the mood, all that. But in any case, you see, this is actually an egg tempera piece that Andrew Wyeth did. He was a master of subtle value, I think. I really love his work. You can see the body here is even balanced by just like a dark spot of grass right here, and it's pretty cool. Also, if you have time, look up the story of this painting. It's really cool. It's pretty inspiring in ways and interesting. But yeah, in any case, enjoy looking at this piece. It is an egg tempera piece, very smooth, really good like layering and depth, much more detailed, I think, I would say, than frescoes. But you can also do a lot of really cool kind of color block and like expressionist painting with this. This is a Jacob Lawrence painting from the Great Migration series, and this is a milk paint. So you can see it's typically thinner. It's kind of streaky because the emulsion makes it where the pigment's not like really solid. It kind of spreads it and shifts it, and so it's pretty interesting. But Jacob Lawrence's pieces are really interesting, sort of geometric abstraction of these figures, African Americans, as they migrate from the South, after the what's the Reconstruction up to the North. That's all Great Migration, and there's some really beautiful work of his, but it's all, or at least a lot of it, is done in milk paint, like this piece here. Okay, so that's tempera. The next one, the next aqueous material, I should say, is a very modern creation of paint. It's actually a paint that uses plastic polymers as the medium or the vehicle, right? So it's water-based with plastic polymer, plastic like gum, that allows it to be durable, flexible, and when it dries, actually I've even heard with acrylic, when you paint it on canvas, it's so plastic that you can even roll up. If you take it off of the wooden frame that it's on, you can even roll it up for shipping and stuff like that. But it's very versatile, and it's also very opaque. One of the things I like to make sure I talk about in this painting section is making sure you guys understand the difference between opaque and transparent, and of course translucent, which is sort of in between. So acrylic is very opaque, meaning it can create solid, heavy layers that are not see-through at all. Opaque means you cannot see through it at all. The color is super solid. It's not streaky. Of course, like cheaper acrylic paints, if they've got a lot of water in them, they can be a little see-through, like the reds and yellows especially. But overall, it's very opaque. And actually, what's cool about acrylic, you can make it impasto, which impasto means that it's so thick that it actually sticks up off the painting. It's almost like a sculpture, right? So it can be really thick, or because it's water-based, you can actually add water to acrylic and do what they call acrylic washes, which thins it out and allows it to be a little bit translucent, which translucent means kind of see-through, like a sheer cloth or something like that. You can see through it a little bit, but not totally. That's transparent. But in any case, yeah, you can layer up the thinner layers, and have like translucent sort of like glaze effect. Like that's what they call it where you have layers of paint that are kind of see-through. But the big thing with acrylic is that it's usually super opaque. So we look here, it's typically kind of blocky. It does dry really fast. You can add like mediums that slow down the dry time, or mediums that make it more impasto, but you see it's pretty blocky. Like acrylic paint really looks like paint, right? It's kind of streaky. It spreads a little. It's like thick, so it doesn't always go down into all the pores of a canvas. It usually, it can be kind of choppy, and but at the end of the day, the colors, they just sit right on top of each other. So one thing that's great about acrylic is if you mess up, you just paint over it and you can't even see what's underneath. So that's pretty cool. They find paintings underneath other paintings all the time. But in any case, it's very modern. It's very new. And this image on the bottom left is what that's what impasto means, right? Where the paint is so thick that it's like sticking up off the painting. It's pretty cool. So impasto is pretty thick, dense, and with acrylic, it's going to be really opaque. Even looking at this piece here, you know, where the white is, it's very white. It's solid paint. Where the red, you know, didn't spread over the blue, that blue is like a solid, but where the red goes over the blue, it is solid red, right? I don't know. You can just sort of see there's, I wouldn't call it cartoony, but there's like a solidness to the color that actually makes it really easy to make things like look shiny, right? Because the white painted right over it, you can't tell there's any colors under that white. It just really pops. But then at the same time, it has a lot of texture. Like I said, it dries. It doesn't spread super well into canvas, so you get a lot of visible canvas texture. But yeah, that's acrylic. Pretty solid, opaque color compared to watercolor. Okay, so what I will, real quick here, as we talk about watercolor, this is where I want you to really think on that whole, what's the difference? Like, why do we call ink painted on paper? Why is that drawing? Even though we're using a brush to put ink on paper, we call it a drawing. And a lot of times watercolor is considered drawing, right? So this is a great place to bring back up, what is the difference between a drawing and a painting? Okay, and I have an answer. Of course, there's no 100% answer. That's just not the nature of the way these materials work. But I do have an answer that I think helps. But I'll say that at the end of the slide. But at the end of the day, what a watercolor is it's not dissimilar from acrylic. Although it's usually a more natural material. It's not plastic based. It's pigment mixed with gum, and that gum is water soluble, so it like breaks down when it gets hit with water. And the more water you put in, the more thin it is, and it becomes more transparent. So transparent means almost totally see-through, and you can almost totally see through a lot of watercolor. It can get so thin that this is like, you know, like rose tinted glasses or something. Versus translucent, you can get translucent layers as well with watercolor if you just use a little less water, so you can kind of see through it, but maybe not totally. And then I guess if you don't put much water at all, it could even be opaque. But yeah, the watercolor allows you to play with all those different levels of opaque, can't see through, translucent, kind of see through, transparent, almost totally see through. Now, this last one right here kind of goes with watercolor is typically done on paper. That's because it has all that water in it. You need something to absorb it. You can do it on a canvas, but it doesn't absorb real well because of the gesso and like other things. Typically, watercolor is done on paper. And that last sentence I want you to really pay attention to. So essentially, one thing that's unique about a watercolor versus acrylic or oil is that you don't really see or use white watercolor. With watercolor, you typically see the white is blank paper because it can get so thin. You know, if you need just a really light section, you just make it thinner and there's more white paper showing through so it looks light. If you need a bright white spot, you just protect that part of the paper and never get any ink there, and it'll look like a bright white spot on like your eyeball or something shiny or something like that. Versus, you know, with acrylic, like I said right here, the white is white paint that you can just go back and just plop right over the top of the thing you need to be shiny. Okay, so given that watercolor shows paper as the white and acrylic does not, for some reason, I have always found this as a great way to define the difference between drawing and painting. Okay, so it gives you something specific. I don't know if other professors would say this is 100%, but essentially, I kind of define drawing as when the white is your paper, right? The white thing, you don't use as much, you don't use a white material. Now, of course, that's all different when you're drawing with charcoal, but basically when drawing, you leave parts of paper blank. When painting, you do not. With paint, you cover the whole thing in paint. With drawing, you don't. You leave parts of the paper showing to either be brights, to be darks, or to just be blank paper. That to me is like one of the biggest reasons that or biggest like easy ways to define the difference between drawing and painting. And that is why also watercolor as a material is sometimes taught in the drawing department and sometimes taught in the painting department. Okay, I think watercolor is a great thing to use to illustrate that. But again, to me, the definition of the difference between painting and drawing is that you leave more blank space in a drawing. Right. That's a simple one. The easiest way to say something is painting is that it uses paint, but paint is not that easily definable. But in any case, yeah, I hope that gives you an idea of the difference. But overall, watercolor is considered sometimes drawing, sometimes painting, but here I teach it as a paint. And you can see here, you can also do a sort of watercolor effect. You can do transparency or translucency with inks and do ink washes. But again, it's the lightness is all about empty paper in the ink wash just as much as the painting here or the watercolor painting here. So this watercolor, right, these sections of bright white sky are blank paper. Now you will see there's a little bit of like a light blue here that's used as a white, and that kind of can work. So they do have white watercolor. It's just not really, really white. But at the end of the day, yeah, there's a lot of blank paper and transparency going on in a watercolor that gives it a lightness that makes it different than acrylic and oil paint and makes it kind of a drawing. Ink wash, I think, too, a big difference between ink wash and watercolor is it just seems like you have less control over ink wash. You get it wet again and it just starts spreading again. Watercolor can kind of dry and really stick. But yeah, ink wash, little less control. And then one thing I will say, so I put ink wash, gouache, and watercolor together. And what gouache is essentially it's just watercolor with a little bit of inert white. And inert white basically makes it a little more opaque. So it's watercolor that they've added stuff to try to make it more opaque. So if you use gouache straight on, it almost looks like acrylic paint, but it does spread better. It absorbs better. It spreads into the crevices of paper or canvas a little better. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's just watercolor that's less see-through. Okay, and you can see here, you can really see it on the one on the left, like using all the different colors. Gouache can be really, really vibrantly colorful where watercolor is more muted, but you can also do this sort of like oily pasty thing with gouache that you can't do with watercolor. You can leave it real thick and spread it almost like a grease or something. And because it's got that inert white, it doesn't make it look white, it just makes it more opaque. It just can be really like pasty looking. Oh, there's also, just for fun, I did this drawing actually, so it's kind of fun to show. Watercolor can be turned into a pastel. Right, so that's a weird deal. Is that a drawing or a painting? I don't know. There's probably no exact answer. But pastel, they're like little oil pastels that you can draw with and then hit with water, and it turns into watercolor that you can spread. I loved it. It's really cool. They also do it in the form of a paint pencil, watercolor pencils, but they're typically, when you hit it with the water, it gets lighter. Watercolor pastel, it like almost got brighter, more colorful, because that pigment was real dense because it was a pastel rather than a pencil. But in any case, yeah, there you can literally turn watercolor. That gum allows you to shape it, and you can shape it into a pencil, you can shape it into a pastel, and then use water on it to make it like a painting and a drawing. So that's pretty cool. It's kind of like both. Like I use sections of paper showing that make it a drawing, but then other parts I really spread it around almost like it was paint. So yeah, pretty cool. I had fun with it. Okay, so non-aqueous paints, there's not many of them, so it'll be pretty quick. Non-aqueous paints, the number one non-aqueous paint is oil. Okay, so essentially it was created towards the end of the Renaissance, and once it hit, it was it, right? People, even today, oil is just like super nice. It's not as versatile and easy to use as acrylic and watercolor has been around forever and ever and ever. But oil, when it came to be, it was like the chosen way of doing like a thick, layered, dense painting. Okay, you mix various oils. The different oils do different things. They make it shiny, they make it matte, they make it dry fast or slow. And at the end of the day, most of them, the big difference between oil and acrylic is that even if you add something to speed up the drying, oil paints take forever to dry. The pigment is mixed with an oil rather than water, and that oil almost, some of them, they say oil paints take like 6 months to dry, some of them, because that oil in there just sits and allows it to be liquid for so long. But then, in any case, yeah, you can add different oils, you can thin it, you can speed up the dry, but it's all about oil. There's no water in oil painting. Even your brushes, you clean them in oil. But yeah, you go from thick to thin painting. As you mix more oil with it, it becomes a little more translucent. I wouldn't say transparent. Oil paint is really translucent and allows you to get these super soft, kind of like foggy finishes that are almost like dreamlike, and the depth of it. I've also heard the science of oil painting is that light will actually go through even thick parts of oil paint, and so when it gets to your eye, it just has so much more complexity and depth than acrylic, which just hits whatever the top layer of paint is and bounces back to your eye. The science of light and oil paint is different as much as the chemical difference in oil and acrylic. But in any case, yeah, you can layer it up. You do lots of glazing. It allows it to be airy and translucent. It is the chosen medium for centuries after the Renaissance, and you can see why right here. The other thing I think that because it's oil and it's like sort of flowy and smooth rather than like kind of thick watery paint is versus acrylic anyway. You know, acrylic always leaves that kind of canvasy, choppy texture, right? And it's real vibrant, opaque colors versus when you get to oil, it goes on thin. You can make it really see-through. And I think it seeps into the canvas so much better. It fills in those gaps and you can get just unbelievably realistic textures, especially in fabrics. And then you can even paint sheer fabrics because you can make the paint sheer, or you can paint really opaque fabrics like quilts, but then you can add these really delicate shines. And the other thing is you can work on a painting for months and months. There's no rush, right? You can come back, you can paint something one day and come back the next day and keep working on it. It's not going to dry unless you want it to. You can do things to speed it up. But yeah, overall, like you can see the difference in the depth and the layering and the just detail of an oil paint, which is partially the way it's used, but it obviously shows you that oil is better for smooth, real painting. You can actually see, you can do impasto with oil paint, and you can see here looking at it real close, it always has this sort of like gummy, almost wet look to it. And like I said, some of them take forever to dry. Some oil paints, they say like almost never dry. Some Van Goghs are like still wet. I don't know if that's really totally true, but at the end of the day, yeah, they just, especially if they're thick, really heavy impasto, the inside might never dry because the oil might just never escape. It's just going to stay in there forever. But yeah, it spreads really well. It goes on really opaque or translucent, depending on how you want to do it, and then just has this nice smooth finish. So you can tell the difference between the impasto here, if you want to go back in the slides or in the video to the impasto of acrylic. There's definitely a difference. Acrylic has sort of a funky flat finish. Oil just has so much more depth. Okay, so the last technical like painting medium I want to cover is encaustic, which is using resin or wax. So they would literally, in ancient times, they would use this. This is kind of going back in time. They would use this in Egypt by just melting beeswax. And they would mix it with pigment, and the wax would be, yeah, the vehicle, and they would use some oils and things to kind of, did it spread more? Did it stay wet longer? But yeah, they would literally heat up the wax, brush it on, and then they would they would pass a final flame over it to seal it. And yeah, literally they could do, this is another thing they would paint a lot on panels. They would paint it on sarcophagi. That's what's on here. It's a mummy portrait on a sarcophagi in ancient Egypt. They would paint it on walls. They would paint it on objects, or they could paint it on stone. But whatever it would stick to, they could paint. And of course, yeah, like papers, they would, they invented papyrus, and now we can paint it on canvas. I've seen it a lot on wooden panel and canvas. But yeah, it goes on heavy. If you put wax over another type of wax, unless it's real translucent, it's just solid blocky color. It's not one you do for a lot of depth and delicacy. It's something you do for color and complexity. It's also really expensive, really long lasting, and again, sort of calls back to like almost ancient styles of making art because it's one of the oldest forms of painting. But yeah, if you want to try it, go for it. But I will say I've tried it once and it was crazy expensive. But if you can borrow someone's encaustics, it is a lot of fun to move that wax around and heat. And then you get a heat gun. You can like stick textures in it. But at the end of the day, it's usually really opaque, solid color. You actually mix the color with the wax yourself sometimes, and that's pretty cool. So a couple of things we want to talk about that aren't really paint, but you want to talk about is at least there are times where you do use paint, but it's not on an easel, right? It's not flat. Paint in and of itself can be a material, almost like those impasto paintings we've seen. You can make paint into a sculpture like Roxy paint here, where it's just solid paint that's been allowed to like flow and move out of this machine and make these lumpy, dumpy things. If you've seen the tall paintings that are just like mixes of acrylic, you can almost peel these off and they become like solid masses. And you could make like your own shower curtain out of acrylic paint if you wanted. Yeah, it's pretty cool what can be done with different paints now in the modern era with all the different mediums and different things we can add to it. They can be sculpture. And plus, every sculpture you make, if it is a painted sculpture, you're adding paint to the sculptural process, right? So painting is something that goes beyond just painting on a canvas or paper, right? You can paint a sculpture, you can make a sculpture out of paint. Then there's also, of course, painting without paint. Just like the talking about drawing with paper, we should talk about painting where you use fabric or other materials to make the paint. So you can use colored objects to arrange them into compositions, into paintings. So fabric is a really common thing. And here's a really abstract example or a non-objective example of like a painting, a composition created out of fabric. So it's almost like painting with just the fabric. And you can dye your own threads and dye your own fabrics and things. Fabric collages kind of fit into this, but of course, mosaic and tapestry are the main, like real, like practical, even ancient ways of painting without paint. So what a mosaic is, and this is a really key thing to know. Make sure you catch this slide. A mosaic is it's a bunch of small colored pieces called tesserae, millions or thousands of little tesserae. Maybe not millions, I'd be insane. Little tesserae, usually made of ceramic or glass, are impressed into mortar or cement. So you put wet cement down, and then you have all these arrangements of little stones or little pieces of ceramic. They would literally like fire tiles of blue and then break it up, and they would stick it into cement, and you could basically make a painting out of little pieces of ceramic or glass. And that's what we see here. The Ravenna Museum. Well, the Byzantine Empire used it quite a bit, right? They would make these tiny tesserae. Make sure you remember that term, and embed it into something in an arranged way to make it look like a form or painting, right? So yeah, even now we use this. Oculus is a piece that's up. I think it should still be up right now in New York, where the subway tiles have been replaced by stones that Kristen Jones rearranged to look like eyeballs. They're little stones and pieces, right? And you can make mosaics out of random stones you find, or a lot of people, like I said, they manufacture ceramic pieces and then break them apart. A lot of people, I knew an artist in Austin who would like all her pots that she made that didn't work out, she'd break them up and turn them into little mosaic pieces. And that's pretty cool. Another way to think of it is like stained glass. It's kind of like that. It's not quite the same as a mosaic because rather than embedded in a mortar, it is put onto a frame. I would say it's the same as a mosaic, but it's just set into a steel frame. It's little pieces of colored glass that, again, they color and then arrange to look like a drawing. And then the light showing through is what shows you the image, right? But it's just small pieces of glass that have been put in place into frames to look like that image, right? So pretty cool. I don't think they really paint much. There's not detail on the piece. There's just multiple pieces to show detail, if that makes sense. In any case, yeah, so that's a mosaic. And then going right along, bringing it back to fabric, you can use yarn or thread or dye on fabric to create a set of images. Well, and really, this is talking about you're using thread or like dyed yarn or something, and you're weaving it and you're setting it up. You're embroidering in a way that, again, the colors of the thread create when you step back an image, right? It's like millions of tiny, this one I will say, millions of tiny bits of thread that are different colors, all put together in a way that those different colors make it look like an image, right? And this was a very cool way of like almost like having murals in your home back in the heyday of the Baroque and the Romantic Rococo eras, like big fancy basically rugs that were paintings made of thread or some other form of textile painting. So it's not making a rug and then painting it; it's actually painting with the colored thread. In a way, it's forming images with the colored thread. In any case, yeah, that kind of goes back to the fiber painting that I was showing right here. But yeah, there's ways of painting without paint, and then we covered all the different kinds of paint. That is all the slides for chapter 7. So how can I stop this? Here we go. All the slides for chapter 7 knocked out right there. I hope that you enjoyed that bit of chapter 7. Once again, if I can say it enough times. So that is the first two mediums, drawing and painting, knocked. Let me know if you have any questions about chapter 7, and we'll talk to you again soon.